Let me paint you a picture. You wake up on a Saturday morning, you walk downstairs, step outside, and within 4 minutes, you're at a cafe, grabbing a cold brew. You wave at a neighbor on the way, you walk another 2 minutes to a market, grab what you need for dinner, and loop back home past a little bookshop and a little park where someone's practicing their guitar. Now, here's another picture. You wake up on a Saturday morning, you get in your car, you drive 11 minutes to a Starbucks drive-thru. You drive another 8 minutes to a grocery store inside of a strip mall flanked by a massive parking lot. You pass 4 identical intersections. Don't see a single human being on foot. You don't know your neighbors. You get home and you realize you forgot something. So you get back in the car. One of those mornings costs you nothing but shoe leather. The other one costs you gas, insurance, car payments, time, wear and tear, and just a little piece of your soul. Millennials, the largest generation in the United States at over 72 million people, are tired of living that second picture. And what I'm going to lay out for you in this video is that they're not just tired of it, they're about to have the political, economic, and cultural leverage to actually do something about it. This isn't a rant, this isn't wishful thinking, the data backs this up. Study after study, survey after survey, dollar after dollar, the evidence is overwhelming that we're approaching a seismic shift in how American cities are built, organized, and experienced. And it starts with understanding 2 forces, one economic and one cultural, that have been pressing on this generation like a vice grip for 20 years. So let's take them one at a time. Here's the economic reality that prior generations really don't want us talking about. Millennials have been subject to some of the most aggressive inflation in modern American history, and it has fundamentally altered the way that they see money, ownership, and what it means to have a good life. Let's just lay out the numbers. According to the Education Data Initiative, student loan debt among millennials has exploded. Average student loan debt per borrower went from about $18,000 in 2007 to nearly $38,000 in 2024. That's a 108% increase, and millennials hold the largest share of U.S. student loan debt among all generations, roughly 40% of the $1.7 trillion total. Nearly 19 million millennials carry student loan debt, and over half of those borrowers report that their monthly payments directly limit their ability to save or invest. Meanwhile, homeownership rates dropped nearly 5 percentage points over the same period. So there's a strong inverse correlation between rising student debt and declining homeownership. A quarter of millennial renters say they never expect to own a home. And among those who have given up on homeownership entirely, 74% say the reason is simple: they just can't afford it. And that rate of millennials giving up on homeownership has increased by over 60% in just 2 years. So here's where it gets interesting from a behavioral economics perspective. When you saddle an entire generation with that kind of financial weight, when you make homeownership feel like a pipe dream, when car payments and insurance and gas eat into what little is left of their paychecks, something shifts in the way that they define value. And that shift has a name, and perhaps you've heard it before. It's experiences over things. A study by Harris Group found that 78% of millennials would rather spend money on a memorable experience than a material possession. Not 51%, not a slim majority, 78%. An Experian report confirmed this trend isn't softening. 59% of millennials say they'd rather spend money on travel and concerts than to save for retirement. And this isn't abstract, you can see it in the numbers. Millennials travel more than any other generation, an average of 35 days per year, compared to 26 for Gen X and 27 for boomers. A McKinsey survey found that millennials and Gen Z devote about 29% of their income to travel. They planned nearly as many international trips as domestic ones in 2024, while older generations planned roughly twice as many domestic trips. Mastercard's travel industry trends report found that overall consumer spending on experiences jumped 65% between 2019 and 2023. Spending on physical goods during the same period, up just 12%. Now, I want you to really sit with what that means. This is a generation that has essentially said, The traditional American milestones, the house, the car, the stuff, either aren't available to us or they aren't worth the prison sentence of debt that they come with. So we're going to pour ourselves into what we can own: our memories, our passport stamps, and our stories. And that's not a trivial lifestyle choice. That is a wholesale rejection of the consumer model that built suburbia. Just think about it. The suburbs were engineered for accumulation. Big lots, so you could have a big house, big garages, so you could have multiple cars, big driveways, big kitchens, big closets. Everything was big because the whole point was to fill it with stuff. The American dream wasn't a feeling, it was square footage. Millennials looked at that model and said, I don't want the big closet, I want the plane ticket. And here's the kicker. They came to that conclusion not because they're philosophically different from their parents. They came to it because the economics left them no other choice. When you can't afford the house, you better learn to love the hostel. And once you love the hostel, once you've walked the streets of Lisbon or hopped a train from Prague to Vienna or eaten the street food in Bangkok, the strip mall back home starts to feel like a punishment. Which brings us to the second force. I need to be careful with this word, resentment, because it can be misunderstood. When I say millennials resent the built environment that they've been placed in, I don't mean that they're anti-development. I don't mean that they're anti-progress. I don't mean that they want to tear down civilization and live in yurts. What I mean is, the choices available to them feel like they range from bad to really bad. Want to live somewhere walkable? Sure. There are a handful of neighborhoods in most American cities that qualify, but you'll pay a staggering premium for that privilege. A study published through the Brookings Institution found that walkable urban places command an average 90% price premium per square foot for sale housing, and rental premiums averaging 46%. The Smart Growth America research that informed those numbers found that each step up the walkability index adds about $82 per square foot to home values and over $300 per month to apartment rents. So walkability isn't just desirable, it's scarce. And scarcity drives price, and price pushes millennials out of the exact kinds of neighborhoods they want to live in. And what about the alternative? The suburbs, the affordable option. Millennials who can't afford walkable urban neighborhoods are being pushed into car-dependent sprawl. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies published research that millennials who initially led a back-to-the-city movement in the 2000s and early 2010s began migrating back to the suburbs, not because they wanted to, but because affordable and right-sized housing wasn't available in the urban cores that they preferred. The research found that millennial suburbanization was strongest in metros with the least affordable urban centers and those with the fewest family-sized housing units. They were leaving neighborhoods with more amenities for ones with fewer, a move driven by necessity, not desire. And now let's add a layer to this that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. This generation graduated high school and college directly into crisis. The Great Recession of 2008, which the Council on Foreign Relations noted was particularly devastating for millennials due to the combination of soaring tuition costs and a cratered job market. And then just as they were starting to recover, COVID-19. The pandemic didn't just disrupt their careers, it inflicted something deeper, a kind of generational trauma rooted in isolation, distance, and disconnection. A study from the National League of Cities found that younger adults were the most likely to report feelings of loneliness, isolation, and anxiety during COVID. A research paper published in the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences confirmed that younger generations, particularly millennials and Gen Z, experienced heightened existential threat during the pandemic, driven not by health fears, but by a loss of meaning and a feeling of being trapped. The 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer found that nearly 70% of adults aged 18 to 34 said COVID guidelines were moderately or very disruptive of their lives, and a majority believed that businesses use the pandemic as an excuse to raise prices. So imagine being a millennial in 2020. You're already financially stretched, you're already questioning the value of the suburban model you grew up watching your parents buy into, and now you're locked in a home, in many cases a suburban home, cut off from the social infrastructure that cities are supposed to provide. You're already financially stretched, you're already questioning the value of the suburban model you grew up watching your parents buy into, and now you're locked in a home, in many cases a suburban home, cut off from the social infrastructure that cities are supposed to provide. And what does that suburban home offer you during a lockdown? A driveway, a yard, a drive-through window if you're lucky. But the coffee shop, the bookstore, the neighbor on the corner, those are all a car ride away. The things that make life feel connected, the things that make isolation bearable, are physically inaccessible without a vehicle. For millennials who had traveled internationally, who had walked the streets of neighborhoods where you could step outside and be immersed in life within 2 minutes, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was clarifying. It crystallized everything that they had already felt about American development. The built environment they were stuck in just didn't fail to delight them, it failed to function. And this is where the resentment lives. Not in anger at progress, in anger at the absence of better options. The Main Street narrative was painted for this generation in schools and pop culture. They grew up watching movies and TV shows set in charming little towns like Stars Hollow on Gilmore Girls, with walkable downtowns. They read textbooks about vibrant American cities, and then they stepped outside into a world of 6-lane stroads and strip malls and parking garages. The gap between the story they were told and the reality they got has felt like a broken promise. And that broken promise is becoming political fuel. So what happens when the largest generation in America, 72 million strong, now between the ages of roughly 29 and 44, entering their peak earning years, their peak political participation years, and their peak household formation years, decides to actively shape the world they want to live in? I think 3 things happen, and the research supports all of them. First, I believe we're going to see a significant wave of urbanization. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't you just say millennials are moving back to the suburbs? Yes, and that's precisely the tension that's going to break. They're moving back to the suburbs because they have to, not because they want to. The Harvard research makes this explicit. The preference for walkable urban living has not diminished. What has diminished is the supply of affordable housing in those areas. But here's what's different now. Millennials aren't 22-year-old renters anymore. They're city council members, they're planning commissioners, they're state legislators. According to Future Caucus, about 25% of all state legislators are now Gen Z or millennial, and that number climbs every cycle. The number of millennials running for Congress rose 79% from 2020 to 2024. In 2022, 40% of all bipartisan bills signed into law at the state level were introduced by a Gen Z or millennial legislator, despite that cohort making up only a quarter of all state lawmakers. And what are they prioritizing? The 2025 local government election results showed a renewed focus on affordable housing, mixed-use developments, and zoning reform, the exact policies that create dense, walkable neighborhoods that millennials have been priced out of. And look at the demand signals. The NAR's 2023 Community and Transportation Preferences Survey found that 90% of Gen Z and millennial respondents want walkable communities. Not just like the idea, actively desire it. A third said they'd pay, quote, a lot more for it. And when asked to choose between a multi-family unit in a walkable neighborhood with a short commute versus a detached single-family home in a car-dependent area, 69% of Gen Z and 55% of millennials chose the walkable option, even if it meant living in a smaller space. That's the majority of the largest generation in America saying, give me the townhouse on the train line, keep the McMansion. I think what we're going to see is a rejection of the single-story, spread-out suburban floor plan. The giant ranch home on a half-acre lot with 30 feet between you and your neighbor, that model was built for a generation that wanted distance. Millennials want proximity. They want to hear the music from the restaurant downstairs. They want to bump into someone they know when they're walking to get groceries. They want to feel a pulse where they live. And the market is already responding. Realtor.com data shows that the share of listings emphasizing walkable features more than doubled between 2024 and 2025. Developers who are paying attention are building denser, taller, more mixed-use products, not because they're urbanist ideologues, but because that's where the demand is screaming. The second shift is public transit, and this one is personal for millennials because many of them have seen what's possible. Remember, this is the generation that travels 35 days a year on average. They take more international trips than any other generation. They've ridden the Paris metro. They've taken the Shinkansen in Japan. They've biked through Amsterdam. They've hopped trams in Prague. And then they came home. And they stood on a cracked sidewalk next to a 6-lane road with no crosswalk, waiting for an Uber because the nearest bus stop is a 25-minute walk away, if it was even running that day. The contrast is devastating, and it breeds the question every well-traveled millennial has asked at some point: why can't we have this here? A Transportation for America and Rockefeller Foundation survey found that 75% of millennials said they would like to live in a place where they don't need a car to get around. 54% said they'd consider moving to a different city entirely if it offered better transit, and 66% said access to high-quality transportation was one of their top 3 criteria when choosing where to live. The American Public Transportation Association reported that millennials consider public transit one of the best options for connecting with communities, and 45% of Americans, nearly half the country, currently have zero access to public transit. That's not a red state or a blue state number. That's an infrastructure deficit that's obvious. Now, I don't think millennials are going to abandon the car, at least not entirely. That's not the argument. The argument is that they want options. Options equal freedom. They want the car in the garage for road trips and weekend getaways, but they want a train or a trolley or a bike lane for Tuesday morning. And here's the economic case that will make this politically viable. Every $1 invested in public transportation generates $5 in economic returns, according to APTA. Every $1 billion invested creates about 50,000 jobs. Home values near public transit are up to 24% higher. Businesses near transit stops generate significantly more revenue. This isn't charity. This is infrastructure that pays for itself over time. And as millennials continue to ascend into local office, city councils, county boards, mayoral seats, expect rail proposals, expect protected bike lanes. The political will is forming and the demographic muscle is behind it. The third shift is arguably the most transformational, and it's one that will force corporate America to fundamentally rethink how they build. Millennials don't want to drive to the grocery store. They don't want to drive to the gym. They don't want to drive to work. They want to walk under 10 minutes or take a short train ride if necessary. This is the vision that urbanist Carlos Moreno coined as the 15-minute city back in 2016, and it gained enormous traction during COVID when being close to daily necessities became, as the World Economic Forum put it, a matter of life and death rather than a nice to have. Paris, under Mayor Anne Hidalgo, adopted it as an official policy. Melbourne, Barcelona, Seoul, Bogota, and even Houston have incorporated elements. The concept is straightforward. Every neighborhood should offer all essential daily amenities: groceries, healthcare, schools, parks, workplaces, social spaces, within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. It demands mixed-use zoning, residential density, and an end to the car-first development model that has defined American planning for 70 years. Now, here's where the corporate response gets fascinating. Because this shift doesn't just change where people live, it changes where people shop. And that means major retailers have to adapt or die. We're already seeing it. Through the past decade, the biggest names in retail have been experimenting with smaller format stores designed for urban neighborhoods instead of highway intersections. Target has opened close to 100 small format stores, about a third the size of a traditional location on college campuses and in dense urban neighborhoods. And according to Target, these small format stores are the company's most productive per square foot. Their most productive store in the entire chain, the Urban Herald Square location in Manhattan. Between 2024 and 2025, Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Nordstrom, and even IKEA formalized what had been experimental, actively downsizing retail footprints to future-proof their relevance. The International Association of Department Stores, which apparently is a thing, confirmed that the trend of betting on smaller spaces is being driven by e-commerce dominance and shrinking support for large, logistics-heavy locations. IKEA unveiled plans for compact plan and order point stores, small hubs where customers can design kitchens and order furniture without navigating a warehouse. This is the future. Smaller stores, tighter footprints, on the corner, not off the highway exit, set into the fabric of the neighborhood, not surrounded by a moat of asphalt. And it's not just retail. Think about gyms, offices, medical clinics, co-working spaces, daycare centers. All of these services have historically been designed around the car, zoned separately from housing, accessible only by driving, surrounded by parking. Millennials are going to demand that these amenities come to them. And the companies that figure out how to do that, how to operate profitably in a 3,000 square foot corner unit instead of a 30,000 square foot standalone building, are going to dominate the next era of American commerce. The ones that don't will be left sitting on enormous leases in half-empty strip malls, wondering where their customers went. Now, I want to be intellectually honest because there are real counter-arguments to everything I've just laid out, and I do think that they deserve some attention. Counterargument number one is that millennials are already moving to the suburbs. This urban dream is dead. I addressed this earlier, but it's worth reinforcing. The Harvard research is clear. Millennials are moving to suburbs driven by affordability constraints and a lack of family-sized housing in urban cores, not by a shift in preference. Even as early millennials have migrated outward, late millennials continue to move into suburban areas, and even the suburban neighborhoods gaining the most millennials are seeing an increase in walkable amenities. In other words, millennials aren't becoming suburbanites, they're bringing urban expectations into the suburbs. They're demanding that the suburbs change to meet them. Counterargument number two. People say they want walkability, but when they have kids, they want a yard. There's definitely truth there. One NAR survey found that 60% of respondents with school-aged kids preferred larger homes with yards, and that number hit 63% among millennials with kids. But this is a housing type preference, not a neighborhood type preference. You can have a yard and still live in a walkable neighborhood. Townhomes with small yards, row homes with patios. The idea that density and green space are mutually exclusive is a product of American zoning, not physics. Amsterdam has yards, Tokyo has yards. The yard isn't the problem. It's the quarter-acre lot in a neighborhood with no sidewalks and only one way in and one way out that's the problem. Counter-argument number three. An MIT study found that millennials don't actually own fewer cars. Well, that's true. When you control for the economic independence, the difference in car ownership between millennials and boomers drops to less than 1%. But that's the point. Millennials own cars because they have to, not because they want to. 78% of millennials surveyed by Zipcar said car ownership is difficult due to high costs. 55% said they've actively tried to drive less, and 53% said they'd participate in a car sharing service. The preference signal is there even whenever the ownership number isn't, because you can't not own a car in a country that was built to require one. Here's where I'll leave you. Millennials are not a monolith, and they're not all going to sell their houses and move to a loft downtown. They're not all going to ride bikes in January, and they're not all going to transform American cities overnight. But the trajectory is unmistakable. A generation that's been economically squeezed into valuing experiences over things. A generation that's traveled the world and seen what's possible. A generation that's endured pandemic, in neighborhoods that weren't built for human connection. A generation that's now entering public office at historic rates and bringing with them a hunger for walkable neighborhoods, better transit, and self-sustained communities. The data is overwhelming. 90% want walkability, 75% want to live without needing a car, 54% would move cities for better transit, 78% prefer experiences to possessions, and the political representation to act on those preferences is climbing every election cycle. The American city is going to change. Not because of some grand plan from the top, but because 72 million people are going to start building the world they actually want to live in. If this resonated with you, hit subscribe. I've got a lot more to say about where we're headed, and if you disagree, and I'm sure plenty of you do, I actually want to hear it. So drop a comment. The best conversations I have about this stuff come from people who push back. I'll see you on the next one.